The Battle of Antietam, a turning point in the American Civil War. The Battle of Antietam, fought on September 17, 1862, near Sharpsburg, Maryland, stands as one of the bloodiest single-day battles in American history. With over 23,000 casualties, it marked a pivotal moment in the Civil War, influencing the course of the conflict and the nation's future. This battle not only halted the Confederate Army's first major invasion of the North but also provided President Abraham Lincoln with the opportunity to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, a document that redefined the war's purpose and legacy. Background: the road to Antietam. The American Civil War, which began in April 1861, was a conflict born out of deep-seated divisions over slavery, states' rights, and the future of the United States. By the summer of 1862, the war had reached a critical juncture. The Union had struggled to achieve significant victories in the Eastern Theater, while the Confederacy, under General Robert E. Lee, sought to capitalize on its successes by taking the war into Northern Territory. Lee's decision to invade Maryland was driven by several strategic objectives. 1. Relieving pressure on the South. By moving the war into the North, Lee hoped to divert Union forces away from Virginia and disrupt Union supply lines. 2. Encouraging foreign recognition. A Confederate victory on Northern soil might persuade Britain or France to recognize the Confederacy as an independent nation. 3. Boosting Southern morale. A successful invasion could galvanize support for the Confederate cause and potentially lead to Maryland's secession, as the state had strong Southern sympathies. In early September 1862, Lee's Army of Northern Virginia crossed the Potomac River into Maryland. His campaign, however, faced immediate challenges. The Confederate Army was exhausted, undersupplied, and plagued by desertions. Additionally, Lee's strategic plans were compromised when a copy of his orders, known as Special Order 191, was discovered by Union soldiers. This document revealed Lee's intention to divide his forces, providing Union General George McClellan with a critical opportunity to strike. The armies and commanders. The Battle of Antietam pitted two of the Civil War's most prominent generals against each other. Union Army of the Potomac, commanded by Major General George McClellan. The Union forces numbered approximately 87,000 troops. McClellan, known for his cautious approach, was tasked with stopping Lee's invasion. Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, led by General Robert E. Lee, the Confederate forces consisted of around 45,000 soldiers. Despite being outnumbered, Lee's army was battle-hardened and highly motivated. Other key figures included Union generals such as Joseph Hooker, Edwin V. Sumner, and Ambrose Burnside, who played critical roles in the battle's unfolding. On the Confederate side, generals like Thomas Stonewall Jackson and James Longstreet were instrumental in defending key positions. The battle, September 17, 1862. The Battle of Antietam unfolded in three main phases, each centered around a specific geographic feature: the cornfield, the sunken road, and Burnside Bridge. 1. The cornfield, dawn to mid-morning. The battle began at dawn with Union forces under General Joseph Hooker launching an assault on the Confederate left flank near a 30-acre cornfield. The fighting was intense and chaotic, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. The cornfield changed hands multiple times as Union and Confederate forces clashed in close-quarters combat. By mid-morning, the area was littered with the dead and wounded, earning it the nickname the Bloody Cornfield. 2. The Sunken Road, mid-morning to early afternoon. As the fighting shifted south, Union forces under General Edwin V. Sumner attacked the Confederate center along a sunken farm road. The Confederates, entrenched in the road, initially repelled the Union assaults. However, a miscommunication led to a gap in the Confederate line, allowing Union troops to flank the position. The road, later known as Bloody Lane, became a scene of carnage as Confederate forces were forced to retreat. 3. Burnside Bridge and the final assault, afternoon to evening. In the afternoon, Union General Ambrose Burnside launched an attack on the Confederate right flank, aiming to cross Antietam Creek via a narrow stone bridge. Despite facing heavy resistance, Burnside's troops eventually secured the bridge and advanced toward Sharpsburg. However, the arrival of Confederate reinforcements under General A.P. Hill halted the Union advance, preventing a decisive breakthrough. By nightfall, the battle had reached a stalemate. Both sides were exhausted, and the day's fighting had resulted in unprecedented casualties. The Union suffered approximately 12,400 casualties, while the Confederates lost around 10,300 men. Aftermath and significance. Although the Battle of Antietam was tactically inconclusive, it had profound strategic and political implications. 1. Halting the Confederate invasion. Lee's retreat back into Virginia marked the end of the Confederate invasion of the North. The Union had successfully defended its territory, boosting Northern morale. 2. The Emancipation Proclamation. President Lincoln used the Union's strategic victory at Antietam as an opportunity to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation on September 22, 1862. This executive order declared that all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory would be freed as of January 1, 1863, transforming the war's purpose from preserving the Union to ending slavery. 3. International impact. The Union victory at Antietam dissuaded Britain and France from recognizing the Confederacy, ensuring that the South would not receive foreign support. 4. Human cost. The battle's staggering casualties underscored the war's brutality and foreshadowed the continued bloodshed in the years to come. Legacy of Antietam. The Battle of Antietam remains a defining moment in American history. It demonstrated the Union's resilience and marked a turning point in the Civil War. The battle's legacy is preserved at Antietam National Battlefield, where visitors can explore the hallowed grounds and reflect on the sacrifices made by soldiers on both sides. In the broader context of the Civil War, Antietam highlighted the importance of leadership, strategy, and the human cost of conflict. It also underscored the moral imperative of ending slavery, a cause that would ultimately define the war's legacy and shape the nation's future. The key strategic decisions made by General Robert E. Lee during the Battle of Antietam. The Battle of Antietam, fought on September 17, 1862, near Sharpsburg, Maryland, stands as one of the most significant engagements of the American Civil War. It was the first major battle to occur on Union soil and remains the bloodiest single day in American military history, with over 22,000 casualties. The battle was a pivotal moment in the war, as it halted General Robert E. Lee's first invasion of the North and provided President Abraham Lincoln with the opportunity to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. This article delves into the key strategic decisions made by General Robert E. Lee during the Battle of Antietam, examining their implications, outcomes, and the broader context of the Civil War background, the strategic context of the Maryland campaign before delving into the specific decisions made by Lee during the Battle of Antietam. It is essential to understand the broader strategic context of the Maryland campaign. In the summer of 1862, the Confederacy was riding a wave of successes, particularly in the Eastern Theater. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia had achieved a series of victories, including the 7 Days Battles, Second Manassas, and the Battle of Fredericksburg. These successes bolstered Confederate morale and led Lee to believe that a bold move into Union territory could further demoralize the North, potentially leading to foreign recognition of the Confederacy and a negotiated peace. Lee's decision to invade Maryland was driven by several strategic objectives. 1. Relieve pressure on Virginia. By taking the war into the North, Lee hoped to draw Union forces away from Virginia, giving the war-torn state a respite and allowing Confederate forces to regroup and resupply. 2. Influence the upcoming midterm elections. Lee believed that a successful invasion of the North could sway public opinion in the Union, potentially leading to a political shift that favored a negotiated peace. 3. Secure foreign recognition. The Confederacy sought recognition from European powers, particularly Britain and France. A successful invasion of the North could demonstrate the Confederacy's viability as a nation, increasing the likelihood of foreign intervention. 4. Forage and supply. The Confederate Army was in dire need of supplies, and Maryland, a border state with divided loyalties, offered the potential for foraging and resupply. With these objectives in mind, Lee crossed the Potomac River into Maryland in early September 1862, setting the stage for the Battle of Antietam. Lee's decision to divide his army. The strategic gamble. One of the most controversial and consequential decisions made by Lee during the Maryland campaign was his choice to divide his army. After crossing the Potomac, Lee's Army of Northern Virginia was spread out across Maryland, with various units tasked with different objectives. Lee's decision to divide his forces was driven by several factors. 1. Harper's Ferry. The strategic town of Harper's Ferry, located at the confluence of the Potomac and Shenandoah rivers, was a key Union supply depot and a potential threat to Lee's lines of communication. Lee believed that capturing Harper's Ferry would secure his rear and provide much-needed supplies for his army. 2. Confidence in his army. Lee had confidence in the fighting ability of his troops, who had achieved a series of victories under his command. He believed that even with divided forces, his army could outmaneuver and defeat the Union forces. 3. Misjudgment of Union intentions. Lee underestimated the speed and determination of Union General George McClellan, who was tasked with pursuing and engaging the Confederate Army. Lee believed that McClellan would move cautiously, giving him time to reunite his forces. Lee's decision to divide his army was a high-risk, high-reward strategy. He sent General Thomas Stonewall Jackson with a significant portion of the army to capture Harper's Ferry, while the remainder of the army, under Lee's direct command, moved towards Sharpsburg. This division left Lee's forces vulnerable to being defeated in detail if the Union Army could concentrate its forces against one of the separated Confederate wings. The decision to divide his army was a calculated risk, but it ultimately placed Lee in a precarious position. When McClellan's Army of the Potomac began to close in on Lee's position near Sharpsburg, Lee found himself outnumbered and outgunned. The Union Army had the potential to crush Lee's divided forces, but McClellan's cautious approach and the timely arrival of Jackson's forces from Harper's Ferry allowed Lee to reunite his army and fight the Battle of Antietam on more favorable terms. The decision to stand and fight at Antietam as the Union Army closed in on Lee's position near Sharpsburg, Lee faced a critical decision: whether to retreat back across the Potomac or to stand and fight. Despite being outnumbered and in a precarious position, Lee chose to make a stand at Antietam Creek. This decision was influenced by several factors. 1. Confidence in his army. Lee had immense confidence in the fighting ability of his troops. Despite being outnumbered, he believed that his army could hold its ground against the Union forces. 2. Strategic importance of Maryland. Lee understood the symbolic importance of fighting on Union soil. A successful stand in Maryland could bolster Confederate morale and demonstrate the viability of the Confederacy to foreign powers. 3. Potential for a decisive victory. Lee believed that a decisive victory on Union soil could have far-reaching consequences, potentially leading to foreign recognition and a negotiated peace. 4. Logistical considerations. Retreating across the Potomac would have been a logistical challenge, particularly given the state of the Confederate Army's supplies and the need to protect the captured supplies from Harper's Ferry. Lee's decision to stand and fight at Antietam was a bold move, but it was not without risks. The Confederate Army was outnumbered and outgunned, and the terrain around Sharpsburg offered limited defensive advantages. However, Lee's confidence in his troops and his belief in the strategic importance of the battle led him to take the risk. The deployment of Confederate forces at Antietam. Once Lee decided to stand and fight at Antietam, he faced the challenge of deploying his forces effectively. The terrain around Sharpsburg offered some natural defensive positions, but Lee's army was stretched thin, and he had to make critical decisions about where to position his troops. 1. The sunken road, Bloody Lane. One of the key defensive positions chosen by Lee was the sunken road, a natural trench that offered cover for Confederate troops. Lee positioned a significant portion of his forces along this road, anticipating that it would be a focal point of Union attacks. The sunken road, later known as Bloody Lane, became one of the most fiercely contested areas of the battlefield. 2. The cornfield. Another critical area was the cornfield, a large open field that offered little cover but was a likely avenue for Union attacks. Lee positioned troops in and around the cornfield, anticipating that it would be a key battleground. 3. The West Woods and East Woods. Lee also deployed troops in the West Woods and East Woods, using the natural cover of the trees to protect his flanks and provide a base for counterattacks. 4. The Lower Bridge. Burnside's Bridge. Lee recognized the importance of the Lower Bridge, which crossed Antietam Creek and provided a potential avenue for Union forces to flank his position. He positioned a small force to defend the bridge, anticipating that it would be a key point of contention. Lee's deployment of forces at Antietam was a reflection of his tactical acumen and his ability to make the most of the terrain. However, the stretched nature of his forces meant that he had to rely on the fighting ability of his troops and the hope that the Union Army would not be able to concentrate its forces effectively. The role of intelligence and the lost order. One of the most dramatic moments of the Maryland campaign was the discovery of Lee's Special Order 191, also known as the Lost Order. This order, which detailed Lee's plans for the division of his army and the capture of Harper's Ferry, was found by Union soldiers and delivered to General McClellan. The discovery of the lost order provided McClellan with critical intelligence about Lee's plans and the disposition of Confederate forces. Lee's decision to divide his army was based on the assumption that his plans would remain secret. The loss of the order was a significant blow to Lee's strategy, as it allowed McClellan to move more quickly and with greater confidence. However, despite the loss of the order, Lee's decision to stand and fight at Antietam demonstrated his ability to adapt to changing circumstances and his confidence in his army's ability to overcome adversity. The Battle of Antietam. Key phases and Lee's decisions. The Battle of Antietam unfolded in several distinct phases, each of which required Lee to make critical decisions. These phases included the fighting in the cornfield, the sunken road, and the final Union assault on the Confederate right flank at Burnside's Bridge. The cornfield. The battle began in the early hours of September 17, 1862, with Union forces launching a series of attacks on the Confederate left flank in the cornfield. The fighting in the cornfield was some of the most intense of the entire war, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. Lee's decision to position troops in the cornfield was based on his anticipation that it would be a key battleground, and he relied on the fighting ability of his troops to hold the line. As the battle raged in the cornfield, Lee faced the challenge of reinforcing his troops and maintaining the integrity of his line. He made the decision to commit reserves to the fight, including the famous Texas Brigade under General John Bell Hood. Lee's decision to commit reserves to the cornfield was a critical moment in the battle, as it helped to stabilize the Confederate line and prevent a Union breakthrough. The sunken road, Bloody Lane. As the fighting in the cornfield subsided, the focus of the battle shifted to the sunken road, where Confederate troops had established a strong defensive position. The sunken road, later known as Bloody Lane, became the site of some of the most brutal fighting of the day. Union forces launched repeated assaults on the Confederate position, but the natural cover provided by the road allowed the Confederates to hold their ground. Lee's decision to position troops in the sunken road was a key factor in the Confederate defense. The natural trench provided cover for his troops, and the concentrated firepower of the Confederate defenders inflicted heavy casualties on the attacking Union forces. However, as the battle wore on, the Confederate position in the sunken road became increasingly precarious, and Lee faced the challenge of reinforcing his troops and maintaining the integrity of his line. Burnside's Bridge and the final Union assault. The final phase of the Battle of Antietam focused on the Confederate right flank, where Union General Ambrose Burnside launched a series of attacks across Antietam Creek at Burnside's Bridge. Lee had anticipated that the bridge would be a key point of contention, and he had positioned a small force to defend it. However, the Union attacks were initially repulsed, and it took several hours for Burnside's forces to finally secure the bridge and advance on the Confederate position. As Burnside's forces advanced, Lee faced the challenge of reinforcing his right flank and preventing a Union breakthrough. He made the decision to commit his final reserves to the fight, including the famous counterattack led by General A.P. Hill's division, which had just arrived from Harper's Ferry. Lee's decision to commit his reserves at this critical moment was a key factor in stabilizing the Confederate line and preventing a Union breakthrough. The aftermath: Lee's decision to retreat after a day of intense fighting. The Battle of Antietam ended in a tactical draw, but it was a strategic victory for the Union. Lee's army had suffered heavy casualties, and he faced the difficult decision of whether to continue the fight or to retreat back across the Potomac. Despite the heavy losses, Lee initially considered renewing the attack on September 18, but he ultimately decided to withdraw his army and retreat back into Virginia. Lee's decision to retreat was influenced by several factors. 1. Casualties and exhaustion. The Confederate Army had suffered heavy casualties, and the troops were exhausted after a day of intense fighting. Lee recognized that his army was in no condition to continue the fight. 2. Lack of reinforcements. Lee's army was outnumbered, and he had no reinforcements available to replace the losses suffered at Antietam. Continuing the fight would have risked the destruction of his army. 3. Strategic considerations. Lee understood that a prolonged engagement on Union soil was not sustainable. Retreating back into Virginia would allow his army to regroup, resupply, and prepare for future campaigns. 4. Political implications. Lee recognized that a prolonged invasion of the North could have negative political implications for the Confederacy, particularly if it led to further Union victories. Lee's decision to retreat was a difficult one, but it was the right choice given the circumstances. The retreat allowed the Confederate Army to live to fight another day, and it set the stage for future campaigns, including the battles of Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. The legacy of Lee's strategic decisions at Antietam. The Battle of Antietam was a pivotal moment in the American Civil War, and the strategic decisions made by General Robert E. Lee during the battle had far-reaching consequences. Lee's decision to divide his army, his choice to stand and fight at Antietam, and his deployment of forces all demonstrated his tactical acumen and his ability to make bold decisions under pressure. However, these decisions also carried significant risks, and the heavy casualties suffered by the Confederate Army at Antietam highlighted the challenges of waging war against a numerically superior foe. Despite the tactical draw at Antietam, the battle was a strategic victory for the Union. It halted Lee's invasion of the North, provided President Lincoln with the opportunity to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, and set the stage for future Union victories. Lee's strategic decisions at Antietam remain a subject of study and debate among historians, and they offer valuable lessons in leadership, decision-making, and the complexities of military strategy. In the end, the Battle of Antietam stands as a testament to the courage and determination of the soldiers on both sides, and to the strategic brilliance of General Robert E. Lee, whose decisions shaped the course of the Civil War and the future of the United States. How did the Battle of Antietam influence the outcome of the American Civil War? The American Civil War, fought between 1861 and 1865, was one of the most pivotal conflicts in United States history. It pitted the northern states, known as the Union, against the southern states, which had seceded to form the Confederate States of America. The war was primarily fought over the issues of slavery, states' rights, and the preservation of the Union. Among the many battles that took place during this tumultuous period, the Battle of Antietam, fought on September 17, 1862, stands out as a critical turning point. This article will explore how the Battle of Antietam influenced the outcome of the American Civil War, examining its immediate and long-term effects on the military, political, and social landscapes of the time, the context of the American Civil War, the causes of the Civil War. To understand the significance of the Battle of Antietam, it is essential to first grasp the broader context of the American Civil War. The war was the culmination of decades of tension between the North and South over several key issues. Slavery. The most contentious issue was the institution of slavery. The Southern economy was heavily reliant on slave labor, particularly in the agricultural sector, while the North had largely abolished slavery and was increasingly industrialized. States' rights. Southern states believed in the doctrine of states' rights, which held that individual states had the right to govern themselves and make decisions independent of the federal government. This belief was often invoked to justify the continuation of slavery. Economic differences. The North and South had developed different economic systems. The North was more industrialized, with a focus on manufacturing and commerce, while the South was agrarian, relying on cash crops like cotton and tobacco. Political power. The balance of power between free and slave states in Congress was a constant source of conflict. The admission of new states to the Union often sparked debates over whether they would be free or slave states. The outbreak of war. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, who opposed the expansion of slavery into new territories, was the final straw for many Southern states. Between December 1860 and February 1861, 7 Southern states seceded from the Union and formed the Confederate States of America. The Confederacy was later joined by 4 more states after the outbreak of hostilities. The Civil War officially began on April 12, 1861, when Confederate forces attacked Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The Union and the Confederacy quickly mobilized their armies, and the war escalated into a full-scale conflict. Early stages of the war. In the early stages of the war, the Confederacy achieved several significant victories, including the First Battle of Bull Run, July 21, 1861, and the Second Battle of Bull Run, August 28 to 30, 1862. These successes bolstered Southern morale and led to a sense of optimism about the Confederacy's chances of winning the war. However, the Union also had its share of victories, such as the capture of New Orleans in April 1862 and the Battle of Shiloh in April 1862. Despite these successes, the war was far from over, and both sides were eager to gain a decisive advantage. The road to Antietam. The Maryland Campaign. In the summer of 1862, Confederate General Robert E. Lee launched an invasion of the North, known as the Maryland Campaign. Lee's objectives were multifaceted: relieve pressure on Virginia. By taking the war into Northern Territory, Lee hoped to relieve pressure on Virginia, which had been the site of much of the fighting. Influence European powers. Lee believed that a successful invasion of the North might convince European powers, particularly Britain and France, to recognize the Confederacy and provide much-needed support. Boost Southern morale. A victory on Northern soil would boost Southern morale and potentially weaken Northern resolve to continue the war. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia crossed the Potomac River into Maryland in early September 1862. The Confederate Army was initially welcomed by some Marylanders, particularly those with Southern sympathies, but the overall reception was mixed. The Union response. The Union Army of the Potomac, commanded by Major General George B. McClellan, was tasked with countering Lee's invasion. McClellan was a cautious and methodical commander, often criticized for his reluctance to engage the enemy aggressively. However, he was also a skilled organizer and had successfully rebuilt the Army of the Potomac after its earlier defeats. McClellan's intelligence gathering played a crucial role in the lead-up to the Battle of Antietam. On September 13, 1862, Union soldiers discovered a copy of Lee's Special Order No. 191, which outlined the Confederate plan of operations. This document, known as the Lost Order, provided McClellan with valuable information about Lee's movements and allowed him to anticipate the Confederate strategy. The prelude to battle. As Lee's army moved into Maryland, it became clear that the Confederate invasion was not going as smoothly as planned. The Confederate Army was divided, with General Thomas Stonewall Jackson's corps sent to capture Harper's Ferry, while the rest of the army moved towards Sharpsburg, Maryland. McClellan, now aware of Lee's plans, moved to intercept the Confederate forces. The two armies converged near the town of Sharpsburg, along Antietam Creek. The stage was set for one of the bloodiest battles in American history, the Battle of Antietam. The battlefield. The Battle of Antietam was fought on September 17, 1862, near Sharpsburg, Maryland. The battlefield was a relatively small area, approximately 3 miles long and 1 mile wide, with Antietam Creek running through it. The terrain was a mix of open fields, wooded areas, and rolling hills, which would play a significant role in the battle's outcome. The Confederate Army, numbering around 40,000 men, was positioned along a defensive line that stretched from the northern end of the battlefield, near the Dunker Church, to the southern end, near the Rohrbach Bridge, later known as Burnside's Bridge. The Union Army, with approximately 87,000 men, was positioned to the east of Antietam Creek, ready to launch an assault on the Confederate positions. The phases of the battle. The Battle of Antietam can be divided into 3 main phases, each corresponding to a different part of the battlefield. The cornfield. The battle began at dawn with an assault by Union General Joseph Hooker's I Corps on the Confederate left flank, near the Dunker Church and a cornfield. The fighting in the cornfield was intense and chaotic, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. The cornfield changed hands several times as Union and Confederate forces launched repeated attacks and counterattacks. The fighting in the cornfield was some of the most brutal of the entire war. The Union forces initially gained the upper hand, but Confederate reinforcements, including General John Bell Hood's division, managed to stabilize the situation. By mid-morning, the cornfield was a scene of carnage, with thousands of dead and wounded soldiers from both sides. The sunken road. The second phase of the battle took place in the center of the Confederate line, along a sunken road that would later be known as Bloody Lane. Union General Edwin V. Sumner's II Corps launched an assault on the Confederate position, which was defended by General D. H. Hill's division. The fighting along the sunken road was equally ferocious, with Union forces making repeated attempts to break through the Confederate defenses. The Confederates held their ground for several hours, inflicting heavy casualties on the attacking Union troops. However, a miscommunication among the Confederate commanders led to a gap in their line, which the Union forces eventually exploited. The Confederates were forced to retreat, and the sunken road was captured by the Union. The capture of the sunken road was a significant turning point in the battle, as it exposed the Confederate center and threatened to split Lee's army in two. However, the Union forces were too exhausted to press their advantage, and the Confederates managed to regroup and hold their position. Burnside's bridge. The final phase of the battle took place on the southern end of the battlefield, near the Rohrbach Bridge, later known as Burnside's Bridge. Union General Ambrose Burnside's 9th Corps was tasked with crossing the bridge and attacking the Confederate right flank. The crossing of the bridge proved to be a difficult and costly endeavor. The bridge was narrow and exposed to Confederate fire, and Burnside's men suffered heavy casualties as they attempted to cross. After several failed attempts, the Union forces finally managed to secure the bridge and push back the Confederate defenders. With the bridge secured, Burnside's corps advanced towards Sharpsburg, threatening to outflank the Confederate army. However, the arrival of Confederate reinforcements, led by General A.P. Hill, halted the Union advance and forced Burnside to retreat. The battle ended with both sides holding their positions, but the Union had gained a tactical advantage. The aftermath of the Battle of Antietam was the bloodiest single day in American military history, with a combined total of over 22,000 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing. The Union suffered approximately 12,400 casualties, while the Confederacy suffered around 10,300. Despite the heavy losses, the battle was a strategic victory for the Union. Lee's invasion of the North had been halted, and the Confederate Army was forced to retreat back into Virginia. The Union Army, though battered, had managed to hold its ground and prevent a Confederate victory on Northern soil. The battle also had significant political implications. President Abraham Lincoln had been waiting for a Union victory to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which declared that all slaves in Confederate-held territory were to be freed. The Union victory at Antietam provided Lincoln with the opportunity he needed, and he issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation on September 22, 1862. The immediate impact of the Battle of Antietam. Military consequences. The Battle of Antietam had several immediate military consequences for both the Union and the Confederacy. Union morale and strategy. The Union victory at Antietam provided a much-needed boost to Northern morale. After a series of defeats and setbacks, the Union Army had finally achieved a significant victory on the battlefield. This success helped to restore confidence in the Union war effort and demonstrated that the Confederacy could be defeated. However, the battle also highlighted the limitations of Union leadership. General McClellan's cautious approach and failure to pursue Lee's retreating army allowed the Confederates to escape and regroup. This missed opportunity led to criticism of McClellan and ultimately resulted in his removal from command by President Lincoln. Confederate retreat and reorganization. For the Confederacy, the Battle of Antietam was a setback, but not a catastrophic defeat. Lee's army had been forced to retreat, but it remained intact and capable of continuing the fight. The Confederates were able to regroup and reorganize in Virginia, where they would continue to pose a significant threat to the Union. The battle also demonstrated the resilience and determination of the Confederate Army. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned, Lee's forces had managed to hold their ground and inflict heavy casualties on the Union Army. This resilience would continue to be a hallmark of the Confederate war effort. Political consequences. The Battle of Antietam had profound political consequences, both domestically and internationally. The Emancipation Proclamation. The most significant political consequence of the Battle of Antietam was the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation. President Lincoln had been considering the proclamation for some time, but he needed a Union victory to give it credibility and demonstrate that the Union was capable of winning the war. The Union victory at Antietam provided Lincoln with the opportunity he needed. On September 22, 1862, just 5 days after the battle, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which declared that all slaves in Confederate-held territory would be freed as of January 1, 1863. The Emancipation Proclamation was a turning point in the Civil War. It transformed the war from a conflict over the preservation of the Union into a struggle for the abolition of slavery. This shift in the war's objectives had far-reaching implications, both for the conduct of the war and for the future of the United States. International relations. The Battle of Antietam also had important implications for international relations. Prior to the battle, there was a real possibility that Britain and France might recognize the Confederacy and provide it with diplomatic and military support. The Confederacy hoped that a successful invasion of the North would convince European powers to intervene on its behalf. However, the Union victory at Antietam dashed these hopes. The battle demonstrated that the Union was capable of defending itself and that the Confederacy was not invincible. As a result, Britain and France decided against recognizing the Confederacy, and the possibility of European intervention in the war was effectively eliminated. Social consequences. The Battle of Antietam also had significant social consequences, particularly in relation to the issue of slavery. The impact of the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation had a profound impact on the institution of slavery in the United States. While it did not immediately free all slaves, it declared that all slaves in Confederate-held territory were to be freed as of January 1, 1863. This declaration had several important effects. Encouraged slave rebellions. The proclamation encouraged slaves in the Confederacy to escape and seek freedom behind Union lines. This undermined the Confederate war effort by depriving the South of its labor force and creating internal instability. Changed the nature of the war. The proclamation transformed the Civil War from a conflict over the preservation of the Union into a struggle for the abolition of slavery. This shift in objectives had important implications for the conduct of the war and for the future of the United States. Influenced public opinion. The proclamation helped to galvanize support for the Union cause, particularly among abolitionists and African Americans. It also helped to shift public opinion in the North in favor of emancipation and the abolition of slavery. The role of African Americans in the war. The Emancipation Proclamation also had important implications for the role of African Americans in the war. Following the proclamation, the Union Army began to actively recruit African American soldiers, forming the United States Colored Troops, USCT. By the end of the war, nearly 200,000 African Americans had served in the Union Army and Navy, making a significant contribution to the Union war effort. The participation of African American soldiers in the war had important social and political consequences. It demonstrated the courage and determination of African Americans in the fight for freedom and equality, and it helped to challenge prevailing racial stereotypes. The service of African American soldiers also played a key role in the eventual passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which abolished slavery, granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, and guaranteed the right to vote regardless of race. The long-term impact of the Battle of Antietam. The turning point of the war. The Battle of Antietam is often considered a turning point in the American Civil War. While the war would continue for another 2.5 years, the battle marked the beginning of a shift in momentum in favor of the Union. The Union victory at Antietam had several long-term consequences that would ultimately contribute to the Union's eventual victory in the war. The shift in momentum. Prior to Antietam, the Confederacy had achieved several significant victories, including the First and Second Battles of Bull Run, the 7 Days Battles, and the Battle of Fredericksburg. These successes had bolstered Southern morale and led to a sense of optimism about the Confederacy's chances of winning the war. However, the Union victory at Antietam marked the beginning of a shift in momentum. The battle demonstrated that the Union was capable of defeating the Confederacy on the battlefield, and it provided a much-needed boost to Northern morale. Over the next 2 years, the Union would achieve a series of important victories, including the battles of Gettysburg, Vicksburg, and Atlanta, which would ultimately lead to the Confederacy's defeat. The impact on Confederate strategy. The Battle of Antietam also had important implications for Confederate strategy. Prior to the battle, Lee had hoped that a successful invasion of the North would convince European powers to recognize the Confederacy and provide it with support. However, the Union victory at Antietam dashed these hopes and forced the Confederacy to reconsider its strategy. Following the battle, the Confederacy shifted to a more defensive strategy, focusing on holding its territory and wearing down the Union's will to fight. While this strategy was initially successful, it ultimately proved to be unsustainable in the face of the Union's superior resources and manpower. The impact on the Union war effort. The Battle of Antietam also had important long-term consequences for the Union war effort. The removal of McClellan. One of the most significant consequences of the Battle of Antietam was the removal of General George B. McClellan from command of the Army of the Potomac. McClellan's cautious approach and failure to pursue Lee's retreating army after the battle had frustrated President Lincoln and other Union leaders. In November 1862, Lincoln replaced McClellan with General Ambrose Burnside, who would go on to lead the Union Army to a disastrous defeat at the Battle of Fredericksburg. While McClellan's removal was controversial, it marked the beginning of a shift in Union leadership, as Lincoln sought more aggressive and effective commanders to lead the Union war effort. The evolution of Union strategy. The Battle of Antietam also played a key role in the evolution of Union strategy. Prior to the battle, the Union's primary objective had been the preservation of the Union. However, the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation following the battle transformed the war into a struggle for the abolition of slavery. This shift in objectives had important implications for Union strategy. The Union began to adopt a more aggressive approach, targeting not only Confederate armies, but also the institution of slavery and the Southern economy. This strategy, known as total war, would ultimately contribute to the Union's victory in the war. The impact on the Confederacy. The Battle of Antietam also had important long-term consequences for the Confederacy. The strain on Confederate resources. The Battle of Antietam placed a significant strain on Confederate resources. The Confederacy had already been struggling to maintain its war effort, and the heavy casualties suffered at Antietam further depleted its manpower and resources. The long-term impacts of the Battle of Antietam on the Confederacy. The Battle of Antietam, fought on September 17, 1862, near Sharpsburg, Maryland, stands as one of the most pivotal engagements of the American Civil War. It was the bloodiest single day in American military history, with over 22,000 casualties. While the battle itself was tactically inconclusive, its strategic and political ramifications were profound, particularly for the Confederate States of America. The long-term impacts of the Battle of Antietam on the Confederacy were multifaceted, influencing military strategy, international relations, domestic morale, and the eventual trajectory of the Civil War. This article explores these impacts in detail, examining how the battle shaped the Confederacy's fortunes in the years that followed, the failure of the Maryland Campaign and its strategic consequences. Lee's strategic objectives. The Battle of Antietam was the culmination of General Robert E. Lee's first invasion of the North, known as the Maryland Campaign. Lee's objectives were ambitious. He sought to shift the war's focus away from war-torn Virginia, secure supplies for his army, and potentially influence the upcoming midterm elections in the North by demonstrating the Confederacy's strength. Most importantly, Lee hoped that a decisive victory on Northern soil would persuade European powers, particularly Britain and France, to recognize the Confederacy and provide much-needed diplomatic and military support. The outcome at Antietam. Although Lee's Army of Northern Virginia managed to hold its ground against General George McClellan's Union forces, the battle ended in a tactical stalemate. However, the strategic outcome was a clear setback for the Confederacy. Lee was forced to withdraw his army back into Virginia, abandoning his invasion of the North. This retreat marked the failure of the Maryland Campaign and dashed Confederate hopes of a quick, decisive victory that could alter the course of the war. Long-term strategic implications. The failure of the Maryland Campaign had several long-term consequences for the Confederacy. Loss of initiative. The Confederacy lost the strategic initiative in the Eastern Theater. Following Antietam, the Union began to take a more aggressive approach, leading to campaigns such as Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, and ultimately Gettysburg. Resource strain. The campaign highlighted the Confederacy's logistical limitations. Lee's army was unable to sustain an extended campaign in enemy territory, exposing the South's chronic shortages of manpower, supplies, and infrastructure. Psychological impact. The failure to achieve a decisive victory in the North undermined Confederate morale and confidence in their ability to win the war through conventional military means. The Emancipation Proclamation and the transformation of the war. Lincoln's decision. One of the most significant long-term impacts of the Battle of Antietam was its role in enabling President Abraham Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln had drafted the proclamation months earlier but waited for a Union victory to announce it, fearing that it would be perceived as an act of desperation if issued after a defeat. The Union's ability to repel Lee's invasion at Antietam provided the necessary political cover. The proclamation's impact on the Confederacy. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued on January 1, 1863, declared that all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory were to be freed. While it did not immediately free all enslaved individuals, it fundamentally transformed the nature of the war. Moral and political shift. The proclamation framed the war as a struggle against slavery, making it increasingly difficult for European powers to support the Confederacy. Britain and France, both of which had abolished slavery, could no longer justify backing a slaveholding nation, undermining the Confederate economy. The proclamation encouraged enslaved people to flee to Union lines, depriving the Confederacy of its labor force and further straining its already fragile economy, escalating the war by linking the Union's cause to the abolition of slavery. The proclamation hardened Confederate resolve but also intensified the Union's commitment to total victory. Long-term consequences. The Emancipation Proclamation set the stage for the eventual abolition of slavery with the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865. For the Confederacy, it marked the beginning of the end of its social and economic system, which was built on the institution of slavery, international relations, and the failure to secure foreign recognition. European interest in the Confederacy. Prior to Antietam, the Confederacy had hoped to secure recognition and support from Britain and France. The South's cotton exports were critical to European textile industries, and Confederate leaders believed that economic pressure would compel European powers to intervene on their behalf. The impact of Antietam. The Union's ability to repel Lee's invasion at Antietam, coupled with the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation, significantly diminished the likelihood of European recognition. Britain and France were unwilling to align themselves with a cause that was increasingly associated with slavery, especially after the proclamation reframed the war as a fight for freedom. Long-term diplomatic isolation. The failure to secure foreign recognition had profound long-term consequences for the Confederacy. Economic blockade. Without international support, the Confederacy was unable to break the Union's naval blockade, which severely restricted its ability to trade and obtain essential supplies. Military isolation. The lack of foreign allies left the Confederacy to fight the war alone, without access to advanced weaponry, financial aid, or diplomatic leverage. Domestic morale and the erosion of Confederate unity. Initial Confederate confidence. In the early years of the war, the Confederacy enjoyed strong morale and a sense of unity. Victories such as the First Battle of Bull Run and the 7 Days Battles bolstered confidence in the South's ability to achieve independence. The impact of Antietam. The Battle of Antietam marked a turning point in Confederate morale. The failure of the Maryland Campaign and the subsequent issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation dealt a psychological blow to the South. The realization that the Union was committed to a prolonged and increasingly brutal war began to erode Confederate resolve. Long-term consequences. Declining morale. As the war dragged on, Confederate civilians and soldiers alike grew weary of the conflict. The loss of life at Antietam and subsequent battles further demoralized the population. Internal divisions. The strain of the war exacerbated existing divisions within the Confederacy, particularly between states' rights advocates and the central government. Disputes over conscription, taxation, and resource allocation weakened the Confederate war effort. Desertion and dissent. By the later stages of the war, desertion rates in the Confederate Army soared, and dissent among the civilian population grew, further undermining the South's ability to sustain the war effort. The evolution of Confederate military strategy. Pre-Antietam strategy. Before Antietam, the Confederacy relied on a combination of defensive tactics and opportunistic offensives to counter the Union's superior resources and manpower. Lee's invasion of Maryland represented an attempt to shift to a more aggressive strategy. Post-Antietam adjustments. The failure of the Maryland campaign forced the Confederacy to reconsider its military strategy. While Lee continued to pursue offensive operations, such as the invasion of Pennsylvania in 1863, the Confederacy increasingly focused on defensive warfare, seeking to prolong the war and wear down Union resolve. Long-term strategic shifts. Attrition warfare. The Confederacy adopted a strategy of attrition, aiming to inflict heavy casualties on Union forces and undermine Northern morale. This approach, however, proved unsustainable given the Union's greater resources. Guerrilla tactics. In some areas, Confederate forces turned to guerrilla warfare, targeting Union supply lines and infrastructure. While effective in some cases, this strategy further alienated Southern civilians and contributed to the war's brutality. The road to Appomattox. Antietam as a turning point, the beginning of the end. While the Confederacy continued to fight for nearly 3 more years after Antietam, the battle marked the beginning of a gradual decline in its fortunes. The failure to achieve a decisive victory in the North, coupled with the Union's growing strength and determination, set the stage for eventual Confederate defeat. The legacy of Antietam. The Battle of Antietam remains a defining moment in American history. For the Confederacy, it was a missed opportunity to alter the course of the war and secure independence. The long-term impacts of the battle, ranging from the Emancipation Proclamation to the erosion of Confederate morale and unity, underscore its significance as a turning point in the Civil War. The Battle of Antietam was a watershed moment in the American Civil War, with far-reaching consequences for the Confederacy. While the battle itself was tactically inconclusive, its strategic and political ramifications were profound. The failure of the Maryland Campaign, the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation, the failure to secure foreign recognition, and the erosion of Confederate morale all contributed to the eventual collapse of the Confederacy. In the broader context of the Civil War, Antietam marked the beginning of the end for the Southern cause, setting the stage for the Union's ultimate victory and the abolition of slavery. How did the Battle of Antietam shape the military tactics of the Union and Confederacy? The Battle of Antietam, fought on September 17, 1862, near Sharpsburg, Maryland, stands as one of the most significant engagements of the American Civil War. Not only was it the bloodiest single day in American military history, with over 23,000 casualties, but it also marked a pivotal moment in the conflict, influencing the military strategies and tactics of both the Union and the Confederacy. This article delves into the intricate ways in which the Battle of Antietam shaped the military tactics of both sides, examining the immediate and long-term impacts on their approaches to warfare. The prelude to Antietam. The strategic context. To understand the impact of Antietam, it is essential to grasp the strategic context in which the battle occurred. By the summer of 1862, the Civil War had been raging for over a year, with neither side achieving a decisive advantage. The Union, under President Abraham Lincoln, was striving to preserve the United States and abolish slavery, while the Confederacy, led by President Jefferson Davis, sought to secure its independence and maintain the institution of slavery. The Confederacy, despite being outnumbered and out-resourced, had achieved several significant victories, including the First Battle of Bull Run and the 7 Days Battles. These successes bolstered Southern morale and demonstrated the effectiveness of their military leadership, particularly that of General Robert E. Lee. Lee's northern invasion. In September 1862, General Lee embarked on an audacious invasion of the North, aiming to shift the war's focus away from Virginia, secure supplies, and potentially influence the upcoming midterm elections in the Union. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia crossed the Potomac River into Maryland, hoping to draw the Union Army of the Potomac, commanded by General George B. McClellan, into a decisive battle. Lee's strategy was risky but calculated. By taking the war into Union territory, he aimed to demoralize Northern civilians, encourage foreign recognition of the Confederacy, and potentially force a negotiated peace. However, this move also exposed his army to greater risks, as it operated far from its supply lines and in unfamiliar terrain. McClellan's response: General McClellan, known for his cautious approach, was tasked with intercepting Lee's army. Despite possessing superior numbers and intelligence, McClellan's hesitancy and overestimation of Confederate strength would play a crucial role in the unfolding battle. The stage was set for a confrontation that would have far-reaching consequences for both sides. The Battle of Antietam, a tactical overview. The terrain and initial dispositions. The Battle of Antietam took place in the rolling farmlands and woodlets near Sharpsburg, Maryland. The terrain was characterized by open fields, stone fences, and several key landmarks, including the Dunker Church, the Sunken Road, later known as Bloody Lane, and Burnside's Bridge. These features would play significant roles in the battle's outcome. Lee's army, numbering approximately 40,000 men, was positioned along a defensive line stretching from the Potomac River to Antietam Creek. McClellan's Army of the Potomac, with around 87,000 men, approached from the east, aiming to dislodge the Confederates and force a retreat. The three phases of the battle. The Battle of Antietam unfolded in three main phases, each marked by intense fighting and heavy casualties. The morning phase, the cornfield and Dunker Church. The battle began at dawn with Union assaults on the Confederate left flank, centered around the cornfield and Dunker Church. The fighting was ferocious, with both sides suffering heavy losses. The cornfield changed hands multiple times, becoming a symbol of the battle's brutality. Despite initial gains, Union forces were unable to break the Confederate line, thanks in part to the timely arrival of reinforcements under General Stonewall Jackson. The midday phase, Bloody Lane. The focus of the battle shifted to the center of the Confederate line, where a sunken farm road provided a natural defensive position. Union troops launched repeated assaults on this position, resulting in a bloodbath. After hours of fighting, Union forces finally breached the Confederate line, but McClellan's failure to commit reserves allowed the Confederates to regroup and prevent a complete collapse. The afternoon phase, Burnside's Bridge. The final phase of the battle occurred on the Confederate right flank, where Union General Ambrose Burnside's corps attempted to cross Antietam Creek via a narrow stone bridge. Despite initial delays and heavy resistance, Burnside's men eventually secured the bridge and advanced towards Sharpsburg. However, the arrival of Confederate reinforcements under General A.P. Hill halted the Union advance, preventing a decisive breakthrough. The aftermath. By nightfall, both sides were exhausted, and the battle ended in a tactical stalemate. However, the Union could claim a strategic victory, as Lee's invasion of the North was halted, and he was forced to retreat back into Virginia. The high casualties on both sides underscored the battle's ferocity and the evolving nature of Civil War combat. Immediate tactical impacts. Union tactics, lessons in coordination and aggression. The Battle of Antietam revealed several critical lessons for the Union Army, particularly in terms of coordination, aggression, and the effective use of reserves. Coordination and communication. One of the most glaring issues for the Union during Antietam was the lack of coordination among its corps. Commanders. McClellan's piecemeal attacks allowed Lee to shift reinforcements to threatened sectors, negating the Union's numerical advantage. The battle highlighted the need for better communication and synchronization of efforts. Future Union commanders, such as Ulysses S. Grant, would emphasize the importance of coordinated assaults and the timely commitment of reserves. Aggression and initiative. McClellan's cautious approach at Antietam, characterized by his reluctance to fully commit his forces, allowed Lee to hold his ground despite being outnumbered. This hesitancy cost the Union an opportunity to deliver a decisive blow. The battle underscored the importance of aggression and initiative in military tactics. Subsequent Union commanders would adopt a more assertive approach, seeking to exploit numerical superiority and maintain pressure on Confederate forces. Use of reserves. The failure to commit reserves at critical moments, particularly during the midday phase at Bloody Lane, was a significant tactical error. This lesson would inform future Union strategies, emphasizing the importance of maintaining a strong reserve force to exploit breakthroughs and reinforce successes. Confederate tactics, defensive mastery and flexibility. For the Confederacy, Antietam reinforced the effectiveness of defensive tactics and the importance of flexibility and rapid reinforcement. Defensive positioning. Lee's ability to hold his ground against a larger Union force demonstrated the effectiveness of well-chosen defensive positions. The use of natural terrain features, such as the sunken road and Burnside's bridge, allowed the Confederates to maximize their defensive capabilities. This lesson would influence future Confederate tactics, with an emphasis on selecting strong defensive positions and using terrain to offset numerical disadvantages. Flexibility and rapid reinforcement. The timely arrival of Confederate reinforcements, particularly A.P. Hill's division at the end of the battle, was crucial in preventing a Union breakthrough. This highlighted the importance of flexibility and the ability to rapidly shift forces to meet emerging threats. Future Confederate commanders would continue to prioritize mobility and the rapid redeployment of troops, leveraging their familiarity with the terrain and the initiative of their officers. Logistical challenges. Antietam also exposed the logistical challenges faced by the Confederacy, particularly when operating in enemy territory. The strain on supply lines and the difficulty of sustaining an army far from its base would influence future Confederate strategies, often leading to a focus on defensive campaigns closer to home. Long-term strategic impacts. The Emancipation Proclamation and political implications. One of the most significant long-term impacts of the Battle of Antietam was its influence on the political landscape of the Civil War, particularly through the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation. A turning point in the war. The Union's strategic victory at Antietam provided President Lincoln with the opportunity to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which declared the freedom of all slaves in Confederate-held territory. This transformed the nature of the war, aligning the Union's military objectives with the broader goal of abolishing slavery. The proclamation had profound implications for both sides. For the Union, it bolstered morale and provided a moral cause to rally around. For the Confederacy, it underscored the existential threat posed by the Union and hardened their resolve to fight for independence. Foreign relations. The Emancipation Proclamation also had international ramifications, particularly in Europe. By framing the war as a struggle against slavery, Lincoln made it more difficult for European powers, such as Britain and France, to support the Confederacy. This diplomatic victory was crucial in preventing foreign intervention and securing the Union's position on the global stage. Evolution of military doctrine. The Battle of Antietam also contributed to the evolution of military doctrine for both the Union and the Confederacy, influencing their approaches to warfare in the subsequent years of the conflict. Union. The rise of total war. The lessons of Antietam, combined with the broader experiences of the Civil War, contributed to the Union's adoption of a strategy of total war. This approach, epitomized by General William Tecumseh Sherman's March to the Sea, aimed to destroy the Confederacy's ability to wage war by targeting its economic infrastructure and civilian population. The concept of total war represented a significant shift in military tactics, moving away from limited engagements focused on defeating enemy armies to a more comprehensive strategy aimed at undermining the enemy's will and capacity to fight. Confederacy. The defense-in-depth strategy for the Confederacy. The experiences of Antietam and other battles led to the development of a defense-in-depth strategy. This approach involved creating multiple lines of defense, utilizing terrain to delay and weaken Union advances, and conserving manpower through strategic withdrawals while effective in prolonging the conflict. This strategy also highlighted the Confederacy's diminishing resources and the challenges of sustaining a prolonged defensive war against a numerically superior foe. Technological and tactical innovations. The Battle of Antietam also spurred technological and tactical innovations that would shape the future of warfare. Rifled muskets and artillery. The widespread use of rifled muskets and improved artillery at Antietam demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of these weapons in inflicting casualties at longer ranges. This led to a re-evaluation of traditional infantry tactics, with an increased emphasis on cover, concealment, and the use of entrenchments. The battle also highlighted the importance of artillery in both offensive and defensive roles, leading to advancements in artillery tactics and the integration of artillery with infantry and cavalry operations. Medical and logistical improvements. The high casualties at Antietam underscored the need for improvements in medical care and logistics. Both sides began to invest more in field hospitals, ambulance services, and the training of medical personnel. Logistical innovations, such as the use of railroads for troop movements and supply distribution, became increasingly important in sustaining large armies in the field. The Battle of Antietam was a watershed moment in the American Civil War, with profound implications for the military tactics and strategies of both the Union and the Confederacy. The lessons learned from this bloody engagement influenced the conduct of the war, shaping the approaches of future commanders and contributing to the evolution of military doctrine. For the Union, Antietam reinforced the importance of coordination, aggression, and the effective use of reserves, lessons that would be applied in subsequent campaigns. The battle also provided the political impetus for the Emancipation Proclamation, transforming the war's objectives and bolstering Union morale. For the Confederacy, Antietam demonstrated the effectiveness of defensive tactics and the importance of flexibility and rapid reinforcement. However, it also exposed the logistical challenges of operating in enemy territory and the limitations of a defensive strategy in the face of a determined and resourceful adversary. Ultimately, the Battle of Antietam not only shaped the military tactics of the Union and Confederacy but also had far-reaching consequences for the course of the Civil War and the future of American military history. Its legacy endures as a testament to the complexities and brutal realities of warfare, and as a reminder of the sacrifices made by those who fought on both sides. The role of the terrain of Antietam Creek in the outcome of the Battle of Antietam, fought on September 17, 1862, near Sharpsburg, Maryland, remains one of the most significant engagements of the American Civil War. It was the first major battle to occur on Union soil and the bloodiest single-day battle in American history, with a combined tally of over 22,000 casualties. The terrain of Antietam Creek played a crucial role in shaping the battle's outcome, influencing troop movements, defensive strategies, and the overall flow of the engagement. This article delves into the intricate details of how the landscape around Antietam Creek affected the battle, examining the geographical features, their impact on military tactics, and the ultimate consequences for both the Union and Confederate forces. Geographical overview of Antietam Creek. Location and topography. Antietam Creek is a tributary of the Potomac River, located in Washington County, Maryland. The creek flows southward, meandering through a landscape characterized by rolling hills, wooded areas, and open farmland. The terrain around the creek is varied, with steep bluffs, ravines, and ridges that provided natural defensive positions. The creek itself is relatively narrow, with a width ranging from 20 to 40 feet, and its banks are often steep and wooded, making crossings difficult without the aid of bridges or fords. Key geographical features. Several key geographical features around Antietam Creek played a pivotal role in the battle. The cornfield, located to the north of the creek. The cornfield was a large expanse of farmland that became a focal point of the early stages of the battle. The tall cornstalks provided cover for advancing troops but also obscured visibility, leading to chaotic and close-quarters combat. Dunker Church, situated on a slight rise, the Dunker Church was a small, whitewashed building that served as a landmark and a strategic position. The surrounding area was relatively open, allowing for clear lines of sight and fields of fire. Sunken Road, Bloody Lane. The Sunken Road was a sunken farm lane that ran along a ridge, providing a natural trench for Confederate defenders. The road's depression made it an ideal defensive position, as it offered protection from enemy fire while allowing defenders to fire from a concealed position. Burnside Bridge, located to the south of the battlefield, Burnside Bridge was a key crossing point over Antietam Creek. The bridge was narrow and easily defensible, with steep banks on either side that made it difficult for Union forces to assault. Sharpsburg, the town of Sharpsburg, located to the west of the creek, served as the Confederate Army's rear area. The town's buildings and streets provided cover and a rallying point for Confederate troops. The strategic importance of terrain defensive advantages. The terrain around Antietam Creek offered significant defensive advantages to the Confederate forces under General Robert E. Lee. The rolling hills, ridges, and natural obstacles such as the creek itself provided numerous opportunities for establishing strong defensive positions. The Sunken Road, for example, allowed Confederate troops to hold their ground against repeated Union assaults, inflicting heavy casualties on the attacking forces. The steep banks and narrow crossings of Antietam Creek also hindered Union movements, particularly at Burnside Bridge. The Confederate defenders were able to concentrate their fire on the bridge, making it a deadly choke point for Union troops attempting to cross. The natural obstacles forced Union commanders to carefully plan their assaults, often leading to delays and allowing Confederate reinforcements to arrive. Offensive challenges for the Union forces under General George B. McClellan. The terrain presented numerous challenges. The rolling hills and wooded areas limited visibility, making it difficult to coordinate large-scale movements and maintain communication between different units. The cornfield, while providing cover for advancing troops, also obscured the movements of Confederate defenders, leading to confusion and disorganization among Union ranks. The narrow crossings over Antietam Creek, particularly at Burnside Bridge, forced Union troops to funnel their attacks into concentrated areas, making them vulnerable to Confederate fire. The steep banks and wooded areas around the creek also made it difficult for Union artillery to provide effective support, as the terrain limited the fields of fire and the ability to reposition guns quickly. The battle unfolds. Terrain in action. The cornfield. A bloody stalemate. The battle began in the early morning hours of September 17, 1862. With Union forces advancing towards the Confederate positions in the cornfield. The tall cornstalks provided cover for both sides, but also obscured visibility, leading to chaotic and close-quarters combat. The rolling terrain and the presence of fences and stone walls further complicated the Union advance, as troops had to navigate these obstacles under heavy fire. The Confederate defenders, positioned on higher ground, were able to pour devastating fire into the advancing Union ranks. The cornfield changed hands several times throughout the morning, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. The terrain played a crucial role in the stalemate, as the natural obstacles and limited visibility prevented either side from gaining a decisive advantage. The sunken road, a natural trench. As the battle progressed, the focus shifted to the sunken road, where Confederate forces had established a strong defensive position. The road's depression provided a natural trench, allowing Confederate troops to fire from a concealed position while offering protection from Union artillery and small arms fire. Union forces launched repeated assaults on the sunken road, but the terrain made it difficult to dislodge the defenders. The rolling hills and open fields in front of the road provided little cover for the attacking Union troops, who were exposed to devastating fire from the Confederate positions. The sunken road became known as Bloody Lane due to the high number of casualties suffered by both sides. Burnside Bridge, a choke point to the south of the battlefield, Union forces under General Ambrose Burnside attempted to cross Antietam Creek at Burnside Bridge. The narrow bridge and steep banks made it a difficult objective, as Confederate defenders were able to concentrate their fire on the crossing point. The terrain forced Union troops to funnel their attacks into a narrow front, making them vulnerable to Confederate fire. Despite repeated assaults, Union forces were initially unable to secure the bridge. The steep banks and wooded areas around the creek made it difficult for Union artillery to provide effective support, and the narrow crossing point limited the number of troops that could be brought to bear. It was only after several hours of intense fighting that Union forces were able to secure the bridge and push across the creek. The final phase, Confederate withdrawal. As the battle continued into the afternoon, the terrain continued to play a crucial role in shaping the outcome. The rolling hills and wooded areas around Sharpsburg provided cover for Confederate forces as they began to withdraw. The town's buildings and streets offered a rallying point for Confederate troops, allowing them to regroup and prepare for a potential counterattack. The Union forces, exhausted from the day's fighting and hampered by the difficult terrain, were unable to press their advantage. The rolling hills and wooded areas limited visibility and made it difficult to coordinate a pursuit. As a result, the Confederate Army was able to withdraw in relative order, avoiding a complete rout. The aftermath, terrain and tactical lessons, casualties and strategic implications. The Battle of Antietam resulted in a staggering number of casualties, with over 22,000 soldiers killed, wounded, or missing. The terrain played a significant role in the high casualty count, as the natural obstacles and defensive positions allowed both sides to inflict heavy losses on each other. The cornfield, sunken road, and Burnside Bridge became symbols of the battle's ferocity, with the terrain shaping the flow of combat and the intensity of the fighting. Despite the heavy casualties, the battle was a strategic victory for the Union. The Confederate invasion of Maryland was halted, and General Lee was forced to withdraw his army back into Virginia. The Union victory provided President Abraham Lincoln with the opportunity to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which declared the freedom of all slaves in Confederate-held territory. Tactical lessons learned. The Battle of Antietam highlighted the importance of terrain in military strategy and tactics. The natural obstacles and defensive positions around Antietam Creek demonstrated the value of using the landscape to one's advantage. Both Union and Confederate commanders learned valuable lessons about the importance of reconnaissance, the need to adapt to the terrain, and the challenges of coordinating large-scale movements in difficult landscapes. For the Union, the battle underscored the need for better coordination and communication between different units. The difficult terrain and limited visibility made it challenging to maintain a cohesive battle plan, leading to delays and missed opportunities. The Union's inability to fully exploit their numerical advantage was partly due to the challenges posed by the terrain. For the Confederates, the battle demonstrated the effectiveness of using natural obstacles and defensive positions to offset numerical inferiority. The sunken road and Burnside Bridge became examples of how terrain could be used to maximize defensive strength and inflict heavy casualties on an attacking force. The terrain of Antietam Creek played a pivotal role in shaping the outcome of the Battle of Antietam. The rolling hills, wooded areas, and natural obstacles provided both defensive advantages and offensive challenges, influencing the flow of the battle and the strategies employed by both Union and Confederate forces. The cornfield, sunken road, and Burnside Bridge became iconic symbols of the battle's ferocity, with the terrain shaping the intensity of the fighting and the high casualty count. The Battle of Antietam remains a testament to the importance of terrain in military strategy and tactics. The lessons learned from the battle continue to resonate in the study of military history, highlighting the need for commanders to understand and adapt to the landscape in which they fight. The terrain of Antietam Creek not only shaped the outcome of the battle, but also left a lasting legacy on the tactics and strategies of future conflicts.